This story of the crowds being fed with just a few loaves and a couple of fish is told 6 times between the 4 Gospels. All 4 Gospel writers tell it, and Mark and Matthew tell it twice, just to be sure that we get it. No other story is told 6 times, so it must be quite an important one. In Matthew's version, the setting is particularly striking. The reading began, "Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew to a quiet place in a boat." The "this" is quite important. The preceding passage is the death or the killing of John the Baptist. John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin and prophet, has been executed, and it's rather a gruesome tale because his head is brought to Herod on a platter in the middle of a banquet. So Jesus is revolted, grief-stricken, and probably concerned for his own safety, and so he withdraws to a deserted place. But it doesn't stay deserted for long, the crowds follow, and so he has no time to himself, and the crowds are gathered. And so the disciples come to Jesus and say, for goodness sake, send them all home because, it's dinner time and they need something to eat. And Jesus says to the disciples, well, you feed them. And they say, well, we've only got 5 loaves and 2 fish. In one version of the story, it's a little boy who brings it, as was quoted in the hymn we just sang. And this one, they just have 5 loaves and 2 fish, probably what they have in their own bags. And Jesus says, all right then, get the crowds to sit down, kind of sigh, do I really have to do this? And he takes the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. He looks up to heaven, he blesses and breaks the loaves and gives them to the disciples who give them to the crowd. Matthew and all the other gospel writers say that Jesus blesses the bread, breaks it, and gives it to be shared. And the words that are used are the same words that are used in the descriptions of the Eucharist. And they are the actions of the Eucharist. We bless the bread, we break it, and we distribute it. There's no doubt in the way that Matthew records this event that we are supposed to go, aha, this is like a Eucharist, like a thanksgiving for life, a sacred meal of communion. And there's also lots of other things we can hear in the story, echoes of the Old Testament, Moses feeding the people in the wilderness, Elisha feeding 100 people with 20 loaves, many, many words of the psalmists, some the one we heard sung this morning, and then a line like Psalm 78, can God spread a table in the wilderness, is a question, and here is the answer. There are echoes of Jesus eating with the disciples on the road to Emmaus or on the beach after the resurrection, and of course also the Last Supper. And questions that we might have as rational 21st century people about how did Jesus do this? Was this really a miracle? The gospel writers are not really interested in those questions. We want to know how. How did it happen? And the kind of most modern theory always goes, well, people actually had food in their bags, and when they saw people distributing food, they got theirs out and shared it too. And that's a nice interpretation of the story. But the gospel writers aren't interested in the how questions. They're interested in what happened and inviting us into the story with all those layers and echoes. We're invited into the story to see what we might notice. And one thing I really noticed this week is that it was not Jesus that feeds the crowds. First, he tells the disciples not to send the crowds away, but for the disciples to feed them. And then when that seems beyond them, Jesus blesses what they have and then gives it back to them to distribute to the crowd. He blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And this is more than just being an effective mode of distribution for a big crowd. It'll go faster with a team. It's about Jesus blessing what they have offered and then giving it back to them to do the work of feeding the people. The disciples were starting from a place of scarcity. We haven't got enough. There's never enough. And Jesus was operating from a place of abundance and plenty. Think back to last week's readings, the list of parables, the mustard seed that becomes a tree, the bread that rises 100-fold with the yeast. They were all definitions of the kingdom of heaven that Matthew longs for. And so here we're now seeing the kingdom of heaven in action. The story could have just as easily been added to that list of parables. The kingdom of heaven is like 5 loaves and 2 fish that when shared are enough to feed 5,000 people. It could have been another one-line little parable like last week's ones. But instead, Matthew recounts a lived experience of the disciples. It's not just an image used to teach them. They get to act it out and so learn from it. They offer up what they have, and then it's given back to them 10-fold, 100-fold, 1,000 times more. And remember also the setting. Remember, importantly for Matthew, this experience the disciples have is in stark contrast to what has just happened before. The terrible death of John the Baptist, the violent and gruesome death in the context of a banquet with the rich and the powerful. So now we have a contrast. John the Baptist's head on a platter and Jesus breaking bread and fish for the crowd. The violence and degradation of our world on one hand and hope and feeding the world on the other. How many places in our world see that contrast every day? Death and violence and starvation, and then hope and food offered. And always there seems to be more violence than food. But Jesus, in a very dramatic way, is showing the disciples that what they have to offer is going to be enough, and more than enough. The world might well be gruesome and violent, the world that will before too long kill Jesus himself, the world that will persecute and pursue those early Christians. The disciples and the community that Matthew writes for live in that world. They and we live in that world. But Jesus shows them and us that by offering what we have, the world can be changed. When we lay the table for the Eucharist, the bread and wine is brought from the back of the church by the chalice bearers. Now, it'd be more convenient, really, to have it up on the table where everything is for setting up, but it's brought from the back of the church for a reason. It's brought from the midst of you, the people, as an offering to the table. It's an offering of the people, like the bread and the fish that the disciples brought Jesus. We also bring our offerings of our money, which represent our working lives, and we bring food for the city mission, representing our care for others. And so all of these things are offered, are blessed by our prayer of thanksgiving that we pray together, and then they're given back to us. We receive the bread and wine as a blessing for our week. The city mission food goes to those who need it. The offerings of our money are used to pay for the running of our church community and for the service of our wider community. So what we offer and what we bring is given back to us. But what else might we offer? What else do you bring with you as you come forward to receive the bread and wine? What is there in your life, at work or at home or in your community? Something as ordinary and everyday as a bit of fish and a bit of bread. What is there that you might like to bring with you this day and other days as you come forward? Think of something really specific. If you're a teacher, think of not just, teaching your whole career of teaching, think of a particular thing that you offer. Is it the way that you listen to your class? Or is it the way you listen to the parents? Is it a creative artistry that you bring to your lesson plans? Is it your super duper organisational skills? Is it your patience? If you're a leader in an organisation, is it your ability to see the big picture? If you're caring for family members, is it your ability to multitask? What is it that each of you would have, something specific that you would like to offer today? Think about that for a moment. And then as we sing our offertory hymn today, and the offertory is brought forward, the bread and wine, the food, your gifts of money, imagine in the procession something else is being brought up, the thing that you're thinking about. Bring it forward. And then see it being blessed and see it being given back to you. And then expect that it will grow. Expect that it will expand. Expect that it will have an effect. Because you never know, there might even be 12 baskets taken up of what is left over after Jesus has blessed your offering.